Hello and welcome to another episode of On Fire on Daily Mirror Online. This is Iswaran Ratnam. Our guest today, joining us via Zoom, played a very critical role during the war in Sri Lanka, a role which even drew him criticism, with some accusing him of being biased. As Norwegian peace envoy, he mediated between the government and the LTTE, but in the end, his attempts and attempts by many others to ensure the peace process continued failed. Erik Solheim, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm always happy to be with great people from Sri Lanka.
So, Mr. Solheim, let me start off. You played a very critical role, as I said earlier, in the Sri Lankan peace process. You were peace envoy, of course. And do you regret taking on that role, considering the criticism and accusations you faced at the latter part of your role as a peace negotiator?
Look, Iswaran, this was one of the most bloody conflicts in modern times, killing tens of thousands of people. I mean, there are still so many people in Sri Lanka missing the loved ones. We had a soldier from the village in the south or a Tamil civilian in the north. People are missing, people they lost. So my regret is just that we didn't succeed, not that we did try. And the fact that we are attacked by extremists on both sides is not concerning to me. I mean, some Sinhalese chauvinists claim that I was too close to the LTT, in the pockets of the LTT and LTT lover. We heard all this. But also now some Tamil extremists in a mirror image claim that I was personally responsible for the defeat of the LTT, or that the Norwegians are to be blamed for the killings of Tamil civilians in the end phase of the war. Overall in the world, I think we should start blaming the warmongers, not those who try to make peace. I mean, peace is what the gods want from us, and peace is what the vast majority of Sinhalese Muslims and Tamils want in Sri Lanka.
But was there a time when you were a peace negotiator where you felt that, enough was enough, there was too much criticism and you just couldn't handle it?
Never ever, because what counted for us was not whether there were some people here and there who criticized. I mean, that's normal. But we had throughout the peace process the confidence of the parties, and of course those were the people who needed to make peace. We had the confidence of Prabhakaran and Balasingham and the LTT leaders. We also had the confidence of Chandrika Kumaratunga, Ranil Wickremesinghe, and Mahinda Rajapaksa, all the key leaders on the Sinhala side or the state side. So as long as they had confidence in us, it didn't bother us that much if there were some critics here and there.
So based on your internal discussions with the LTT, did you ever think the LTT was genuinely committed to peace?
Absolutely, and here there is a misconception in the South, because please recall that LTT sued for peace at the peak of the power. LTT never before nor later was as strong as in 2000, 2001. They had overwhelmed the Elephant Pass. They were very, very close to overtaking the entire Jaffna Peninsula. They were just beaten back in the last moment because of Pakistani help to the government. And they had destroyed the Sri Lankan economy with the attack on the Bandaranaike airport. So it was at the peak of the strength that the LTT sued for peace, which of course showed that they were absolutely genuine. However, whether they were ready to go all the way to a federal settlement, which was the only end result of a peace process, you may question. I think Prabhakaran sued for peace, wanted peace, were ready for peace, but he should have done a lot more to accept the only compromise which was available, which was federalism.
But there were allegations the LTT used the peace process to regroup and strengthen their military capabilities. And Norway was accused back then of helping the LTT procure arms as well. Is there any truth to those claims?
Absolutely no, of course. I mean, we were not giving gifts to or taking gifts from any side. But more importantly, this is also another misconception in the South, because the Sri Lankan army strengthened itself more during the peace process than the LTT, which we also saw when we came to the final days of the war in 2007 to 2009. And the reason is very obvious. It's much more difficult to keep a rebel army at a time of peace than to keep a government army, because the resources of the government is much stronger. Sri Lanka, of course, also had broad support from nearly all governments in the world, whether it was India or US or China or the European powers. They all wanted peace, but if they had to make the choice between the LTT and the government, they were all on the government side. So the government strengthened its position from 2002 until 2006, 2007, not the LTT.
And how was it dealing with the government back then? How was it dealing with then President Mahinda Rajapaksa and then Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa?
Mahinda came into power as president in 2005. I don't think he had any clear plan as to how to handle the peace process, and he listened to our advice. But we have to be fair to him. He also got into a difficult position because Prabhakara made life difficult for him at the time when the LTT started all these roadside bombs killing Sinhalese soldiers in the north. Prabhakara and Mahinda had 2 rounds of talks or through the proxies in Geneva, which were completely organized and unsuccessful. But at the time, we tend to forget this by hindsight. Mahinda told me that he was completely open to having a summit with Prabhakaran, and that they would agree to LTT dominating the north as long as it was within one Sri Lanka. What Mahinda didn't want at the time was a long, protracted peace process, which he felt would undermine his political position in the south. So situation in 2006 was very, very different from what we anticipate today. And I think it was probably the last missed opportunity for peace.
So when you say Mahinda Rajapaksa was ready for a summit with Prabhakaran, was that message communicated to Prabhakaran as well?
Absolutely, of course. I mean, none of this we made public at the time. But now it's 15 years later, so I think we can speak openly about this. There were 2 different approaches to the peace process. The LTT from the very beginning wanted a step-by-step approach, winning confidence and making different acts of both sides which could promote peace, while the government wanted to move much faster to the end discussion, which was of course what sort of autonomy, self-rule, self-government, self-determination, you choose the word, what sort of self-determination will Tamil have within one state of Sri Lanka? Of course, a separate state was never on the cards. That could never be the result of the peace talks, but nor, of course, a unitary state where everything was run from Colombo. So obviously the compromise had to be something in between, which is federalism. And I think Sri Lankans should relax. You can just watch across the bay to India. Federalism is working very well in India. Look to the fact that India has any number of religions, any number of poor people, right people. Is one of the most complicated places on earth. But there has been very little violence in India, very few wars in India. Why? Well, there is federalism. The state of Andhra Pradesh, where people are speaking Telugu, or the state of Kerala, where people are speaking Malayalam, they have a lot of powers to run their own affairs without interference from Delhi, while at the same time, of course, being part of the Union of India.
So could India maybe have played a bigger role in this whole conflict back then?
India was a firm supporter of the peace process throughout. They always said there is no solution to this conflict except a negotiated settlement. Only in 2008, around September, the Indians started to change their opinion, thinking that it could be a military settlement, meaning that the Sri Lankan government could win the war. But up to that point, India was firm in its belief that the result needed to be a negotiated one. True, India provided military and other logistic and other support to the government in the final phase of the war. But throughout the peace process, as long as a peace was realistic, India supported peace, no doubt, absolutely no doubt.
And looking back, what could Norway as peace negotiator have done differently to ensure the lives were saved and the war came to a peaceful end?
Because we have spent a lot of time trying to reflect on that issue. It's also well covered in the main book about the peace process, Mark Salter's book to end the civil war. I believe there were two main obstacles to peace. One was the lack of cohesion in Colombo. At the time, of course, there were two main parties, Sri Lanka Freedom Party and United National Party. They were fighting every issue. It's not like if Chandigarh did something, Rana would support or vice versa. So the conflict between the two made it very, very difficult to make a real offer to the LTT. And it made it also difficult for the LTT to believe that if they agreed to, say, federalism, that it could be carried by the two main parties in Colombo through a referendum. So we could not resolve the issues between the two main parties in Colombo, but maybe we could have worked even more closely with India and others who could have done that. And the second mistake was that we were not able to convince Prabhakaran at the end that federalism was a solution to the conflict, and we should have been allowed to speak a lot more to Prabhakaran, because I was probably the one non-Tamil in the world who met him most often, but very, very few foreigners met Prabhakaran. For the last couple of decades of his life, as far as I know, he never met any Sinhalese. He once met a Muslim delegation headed by Rauf Hakim, and he met a very limited number of foreigners. That gave him a very wrong perspective on the world, in my view. He didn't really understand the outside world. And if we had been allowed to spend more time with him, and if we allowed more foreigners to speak to him, it would have been more easy to convince him that he also needed to compromise. Both sides need to compromise if you want a peaceful settlement.
And talk to us a little about Prabhakaran. You had so many meetings, as you said, with him. How was he as a man? Was he this person who was really set mostly on just fighting his way out of this, or was he someone open to like enjoying what the other Sri Lankans and the world enjoyed back then?
He, of course, was a masterful military leader for very long, until the last phase of the war. I mean, you cannot object to that. I mean, the LTT is the only non-military, non-state group in the world who has established its own air force, its own naval forces, and with small resources overrunning Sri Lanka and the Elephant Pass, or stopping the offensives the government applied in the north. So until the last phase, he was brilliant military mind. His political understanding, unfortunately, was much less than this. He had very little understanding of the South, meaning the Sinhalese situation, very little understanding of India or the outside world. And many Tamils, unfortunately, coming, say, from the diaspora, gave him all the wrong advice, told him to be non-compromising and strict rather than finding ways out of the conflict. To his credit, he kept all his promises. Whenever he promised to stop terrorism or stop military actions, he stopped the day after, and he had full control over his forces. Balasingham was his main confidant and main advisor, and as long as he listened to Balasingham, nearly everything got right. When he didn't listen to Balasingham, he got it wrong. And when it comes to his personality, I mean, he enjoyed food. He was claimed to be a good cook, and we had very nice meals together. But he was a kind of guarded person, so it was not easy to really become close to him in the same way that you could be with, say, Chandigarh, which is a fantastically open-minded personality which want to cram you and have a party with you.
And you recently tweeted saying you knew the thinking of then LTT peace negotiator Anton Balasingham than most others. Had Balasingham ever revealed plans by the LTT to carry out terror attacks before the LTT actually implemented or executed those plans?
Absolutely not, and for the obvious reason that Balasingham was never involved in the planning of military events or terrorist attacks. I mean, Balasingham was the civilian political advisor. He was the older brother of Prabhakaran, basically the only person in the movement who was older than Prabhakaran. And he gave very good advice on how to understand the South, how to understand the global context, how to go for peace. At the end of the day, Balasingham was the bedrock of the peace process. I mean, he was the person who really moved it forward, but he was not involved in military affairs. And if Prabhakaran had listened to Balasingham, a lot would have been different. Balasingham told me that LTT may lose the east, it may even lose the north, because he objected to Balasingham's attempt, which of course was mirrored by Mahinda's, to go back to war. He thought the peace process should continue, and the LTT should not attempt a new military overall strategy. So, yeah, I mean, you have all these what ifs in history, but I'm sure if LTT had listened to Ballasingham's advice, Sri Lankan Tamils would have been in a much, much better position today. They would probably have enjoyed some kind of self-rule in the north within one Sri Lanka, and would have felt much more comfortable than most Tamils do today.
And when and what was your last conversation with the LTT on the ground?
Our last conversation we can date very specifically because it was the 17th of May 2009. It was the Norwegian National Day, so we had huge celebrations here. And then Poli Devan, the head of the Peace Secretariat of the LTT, called us and he said, "Hey, this has now come to an end. We want to surrender to the Sri Lankan army. Can you help us?" And we said, it's far too late for us to give you any help at the battlefield. That can never be done. I mean, that should have happened earlier, but leave that aside. At this point, we can do nothing. We advise you to hoist a big white flag. If you have some loudspeakers, maybe you can make your intention to surrender clear by loudspeaker, and then we will inform the Sri Lankan government about your intention, yours and Nadesan, who's the head of the political wing of LTT, their intention to surrender. We informed the government. Others did the same. There were some Indian parliamentarians who were also involved and some embassies. So the government was very properly informed about this. The day after, we got the message that both Poli Devan and Nadesan had been killed. Because I do not know the exact circumstances as to what happened, but it's very, very hard to believe that they were not just killed by cold blood by the Sri Lankan army.
And do you think,
which is of course an act of war crime, and if people want to surrender, they should be allowed to surrender and then taken into custody, and if that was the decision, they should have been brought to court.
And from the information that you had, do you know if Prabhakaran also surrendered, or he was just killed in fighting?
I have no information about that, but it seems all indications are that both he and his family was killed in around the 18th of May at the very end of the conflict. What's of course interesting is that a few months earlier we made an offer which I still believe could have resolved the problem at the time. The offer was backed by the United States, the United Nations, by India, so it was a very strong offer. That was an offer to Prabhakaran to get to an organized end to the war. We told him, hey, you are losing. There's no way you can win this. I mean, the territory is shrinking and shrinking, and your army is going down the drain by the day. Let's find an organized end to the war. Every Tamil civilian, every LTT cadre, whether they're privates or officers, names will be taken, photos will be taken, they will be registered, they will be taken by ship from northern Sri Lanka, and people will either go to the south or they will go abroad, and we will have the backing of the big powers like India and the US to make sure that no one is harmed after they have handed themselves over. For some time, we were confident that this may work, but at the end in April 2009, Prabhakaran rejected this plan. And after that, of course, we know then that at the moment I don't think there's any key leader of the LTT who survived, and of course, thousands upon thousands of civilians and others died.
And
they were killed by the Sri Lankan army, for sure. The shelling and indiscriminate killing was completely unacceptable. However, Prabhakaran could also have resolved it if he had accepted this compromise formula.
Looking back, Sri Lanka today is rebuilding since the war. Do you think military action may have been the best solution, considering the fact that the LTT was not giving in either?
First of all, we should celebrate peace because peace is very, very important. People are at least able to restart their lives. But I don't think a military solution was the right one. I think a compromise should have been found. And we need to remember that the main political issue which has torn apart Sri Lanka for the last 50 years is not yet resolved. There is no Tamil self-rule, self-government, self-autonomy, self-determination, whatever term you want to use. Tamils feel second-class citizens in the Sri Lankan state. This is often difficult to understand for Sinhalese because Sinhalese is the vast majority, and for them to understand how what Sri Lanka look like from a Tamil or a Muslim perspective may be difficult. But at least now it's peace, and looking forward, Sri Lanka need to develop economically. There's a lot of positives in Sri Lanka on education, health. I mean, it's have a high life expectancy and it's a beautiful place with a decent life, but of course it needs to develop fast economically to catch up with places like, say, Singapore or China or the most successful states of India, whatever. And Sri Lanka need to find a way to make sure that the minority rights of Tamils and Muslims and their self-government within Sri Lanka is guaranteed. That did not come from the military victory. But it's not too late. The Rajapaksas now has an overwhelming majority in parliament. They won a spectacular election victory. So no time is come for them to reach out to Tamils to find a lasting compromise.
And I had spoken to a few members of the Sri Lanka monitoring mission and got a feel of how their mindset is since the end of the conflict. How has your state of mind been since giving up your role as peace negotiator?
The most striking is, of course, the people you are missing. People who you were very close to for many years. On the government side, Lakshman Kadigamar, I cannot tell how many meetings I had with him, killed in 2005 by the Tigers. On the LTT side, Puli Devan, who was also always a very decent man who wanted to make peace, also killed. Because, as I said, Anton Balasingham was the bedrock of the peace process. He died by cancer, not by war wounds, but he was also a great man. Or Nilantiru Shelvan was killed by the Tigers. A great Tamil, didn't agree with the LTT, but could have been a brilliant leader for a future Sri Lanka. So there are so many people I miss, and that's, I think, what I closest to my mind. And these are just a few examples. Of course, there are so many others.
And in the past few years, you have been fighting to protect the environment. What drew you to take on a role of defender of the environment from defender of peace?
Well, to me, these two are so much the same. If you look to what are the main issues on planet Earth in 2020, I believe basically there are three. We need to keep peace because we cannot continue killing each other. We need to protect the environment and Mother Earth. We cannot destroy it with pollution, make climate change, make different species go extinct. We should care for Mother Earth as we care for our own mother. And thirdly, it's the development. There are still too many poor people on the planet who don't really know what to eat tomorrow or how they can get education for their children. But all these three come together. And the very good news is that we have now policies which are very good for development and for peace and for environment at the same time. Just as an example, we can shift from coal to solar energy and wind energy in all places. It's creating more jobs, better for the economy, while of course much kinder to Mother Earth at the same time.
And do you see a future role for you in Sri Lanka?
Not really. Of course, I will stay engaged with Sri Lanka for my entire life and hope to come back soon. If I called upon by anyone to help on the economy, on development, on environment, and a lot of people have contacted me on the environment, I'm happy to help because I have a big heart for Sri Lanka. And even if there are a few extremist Tamil or Sinhalese who don't like me, I'm confident because I got so many kind messages from the majority of Sri Lankans. I have many friends and I'm happy to help. I don't see any particular role.
That's all the time we have for this program. Mr. Erik Solheim, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for your interest.